let's get started. I would first of all like to thank Gad for his excellent session, an act that's very difficult to follow, not only in terms of the content, but also as far as the delivery is concerned and the emotional engagement. All those images of children and Lego blocks and even a rabbit this time, okay? So I thought I can't possibly start again with a little poem, a little rhyme, or another image of a baby, although I was tempted, I must say. So I thought, how am I going to start this when I talk about emotional engagement? Well, that's always the reactions I get from ladies when I put an image of George Clooney into my talks. And there's real no other reason than getting a smile from the ladies in the audience for putting a photo of George Clooney in. Well, actually, I'd like to start with a little anecdote. I was traveling Italy a couple of years ago, actually a bit more, a few years ago, and I was giving talks in various cities in Italy. And one night, I was sitting in my hotel room, and I was watching television. And up came the commercials. Now, I'm not somebody normally who loves watching commercials, but there was one commercial with George Clooney in it, and it was excellent. Can you guess what the commercial was all about? No. It was about a drink, but it wasn't Nespresso in those days. Martini, actually, I believe. Martini, actually. And some of you may have seen this commercial. It was a great commercial. I really liked it. I'd like to briefly describe it. There was this opening scene where the camera was panning over this reception area in this flashy five-star hotel. And then the camera zoomed in on the sliding doors, which opened, and in came George Clooney. There was a zoom on his face, and we could see the cunning smile on his face. There was a cut. In the next situation, we saw a group of stunning ladies partying, ladies only, partying in one of the rooms of the same hotel. Cut. We see George Clooney walking down the corridor with, again, this cunning smile on his face. So you can kind of guess where he was going, right? So he walked up to that room, put his finger on the ringer, and we could then see one of the ladies from inside walking to the door, looking through the peephole, and she saw George Clooney standing out there. So she opens the door, and she goes, "George." I've practiced that for at least half an hour. "George," she goes. And then she's looking, and she notices that he's not bringing any present. And she says, "No martini?" And he goes, "No." And she slams the door on him and says, "No martini, no party." Well, I was in that hotel, and the next morning I went down to have breakfast. And I got to this breakfast room, which was almost as big as this room here. And I couldn't see one single free table. So I thought, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And then I noticed there was one seat available back there. But there was a lady sitting at that table. And as I was walking closer, I noticed that the lady sitting at the table was one of the ladies from that commercial. And I'm a very shy person. But I was hungry. So I walked up to her and I said, "Would you mind?" And she said, "No, of course not." And so I sat down there and we were having this nice conversation. And I said, "You know, I saw you last night on television." And she said, "Oh, that commercial." And she had this strange look on her face. And so I asked her about it. And she said, "Well, you know, I mean, this stupid slogan, you know, no martini, no party." Okay, she said, "What we actually wanted to say was something completely different, but the director forced us to say no martini, no party." So I said, "What did you want to say?" And she said, "Well, what we actually wanted to say was No emotions, no learning. Okay, so this is the first little story I want to start my talk with. You could call it a lie, but you could also call it a metaphor, okay? And the other thing I want to use is a short clip from a film. I actually found it on a website, and I was a bit hesitant to use this clip because the website it comes from is called mybookssucks.com. It's true. And I thought, it's not a metaphor, it's true. I thought for somebody like me who writes books, it might not be the best omen to start a talk with. However, the clip is perfect because some of you, and I'm sure quite a few of you, must have actually seen it. It comes from a pretty old American film, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Okay. I think it's just so suitable, really, to begin a talk on emotional engagement because it so perfectly shows what the opposite of emotional engagement, complete boredom, is all about. This is not from a language class. It's a lesson on economics. It's students, if I remember correctly, at their first year at university. And well, let's just watch this clip. Enjoy. Okay, Voodoo Economics, and probably Voodoo teaching too. If we asked a number of colleagues what they actually thought was causing the students' behavior, we would get all kinds of different answers. Lack of motivation, maybe. The subject matter, maybe not too motivating either. A colleague who doesn't seem to be the world's most inspiring teacher, maybe the group dynamics, what have you. And there is, of course, a truth to each of these explanations. But what really causes the students to behave the way they do here, or what's behind of all those phenomena like lack of motivation, et cetera, is actually the students themselves, or I will argue, their brains rather. So this is about emotion and the impact that emotional engagement has on the outcomes of our teaching and learning processes. And it's about adult students. But those of you who are teaching younger learners, young learners or teenagers, I hope you will find also a number of interesting things in this talk. It's just that the examples I'm using come from adult classrooms. Well, some of you at this point may be thinking, well, I don't know. I mean, emotions, that sounds a little bit like flower power teaching, you know? Learning a language is, after all, about a lot of mental effort, isn't it? It's about somehow remembering long lists of words and chunks of language and language constructs and things like that. It's why would it be about emotions? It's about understanding complex grammar concepts, and it's all about the mind. But why emotions? And of course, this kind of thinking, this separation of logical thinking, critical thinking, and emotional engagement goes back at least 2,400 or so years to Aristotle, actually, who was talking about the elements of persuasion. In other words, what kind of strategies, what kind of elements needs a good speaker needs to have, elements that also are important in teaching, in getting our message across. And he basically said it's three elements of persuasion. The first one, ethos, which assures that the audience perceives him, it was always a him in those days, as possessing credibility. Number two, pathos, arousing in the audience some kind of emotion, emotion that actually makes the audience sympathetic to the speaker's viewpoint. And thirdly, logos, proving the truth of his message by logic and reasoning. And it's actually this logic and reasoning that, according to Aristotle, is the most important of these three elements. He actually talks about human reason being the most godlike part of human nature. A life guided by human reason is superior to any other. For man, as I said, woman didn't exist in those days. For man, this is the life of reason, since the faculty of reason is the distinguishing characteristic of human beings. So our ability to think, our ability to reason, our ability to use our cognition being far more important than emotional engagement. Only in recent years, maybe in the last 10 or 15 years or so, cognitive scientists have actually shed light into a very different kind of thinking and stress that emotions are as important as the cognitive processes of our learning. And this quotation comes from a book by Lazarus and Lazarus, who actually say that many myths exist about emotions. One of these is that emotions are irrational and don't depend on thinking and reasoning. Actually, they say emotions and intelligence go hand in hand, which is why humans, highly intelligent beings, are such emotional animals. In our field, I think the first authority who actually stressed the importance of emotional engagement was probably Earl Stevick. In his first edition of Memory, Meaning, and Method, which I can't remember exactly, but I think it was written in the late 80s, early 90s, he actually spoke about the importance of emotional engagement. And that happened, before the days of functional magnetic resonance imaging and all those wonderful tools that neuroscientists have these days that makes it possible for them to look into the brain, so to speak. Earl Stevick actually in those years already said, emotions are important, but he also raised the question, is that just how these emotional factors influence the process of memory is still the subject of some discussion. Well, neurobiology has, come a long way since then. So there are now some answers, actually, that in those days were not available yet. When we talk to students, they often refer to language learning, the process of learning a language, the process of using the language they are learning, and to language itself as giving them positive or negative emotions, as giving them pleasure or as being a pain. I recently held an interview with a very interesting young adult student. He was, at the time of the interview, I think he was just turning 18, and he was in one of the classes of a colleague of mine, a friend of mine actually, and I learned that this young guy had actually learned, I think, 6 languages to at least B2 level, and only 2 of those languages he had learned at school. So he'd learned 4 other languages by himself. So I was really interested in talking to him. And I spoke to him about his motivation for learning languages. And this is what he said. It's a bit of a longer quotation, but I hope you don't mind. I think it's really interesting. So he said, this almost blew me away that he quoted Wittgenstein in the first 2 minutes of our discussion, actually. He said, my interest in languages arose when I started to read lots of books and watch lots of films and listen to music. But I didn't understand the original languages in them, and I hated that. what Wittgenstein said about the limits of my language being the limits of my world has always meant a lot to me. When I first learned English and Italian, I noticed that with each of those languages, I gained a new insight into reality. And that was a fantastic feeling. I'm keen on having as many perspectives on reality as possible. And then when I learned Arabic, another and completely different new world opened up to me. And here he's now talking about this emotional impact that language, and in this particular case, Arabic has on him. He says, it's the sound of languages that I love. And I'm totally in love with the sound of Arabic. I had a friend once who was from Palestine, and I used to ask her to read books aloud to me. We used to sit in a cafe, and she would read to me, and that was how I learned to speak Arabic. What a beautiful experience that was. So we have students referring to language or the language learning process or the process of using the language as being a pleasurable experience. But of course, we also know, and this is when we suffer as teachers, that we get students who, for whom learning a language is anything but pleasure. And there is one example here of a student who says, I'm studying the English when I won't speak. I'm just reading this out because I'm not sure if you can read it back there. I won't speak. I have great problems with construct my sentences. I try hard, but it's the conversation my problem. My English is okay for understanding when I read. My writing is okay too, not brilliant, but okay. But I can't speak, no fluently. As soon as I try speaking English, I'm struggle. Then I can't think, I forget words, grammar, everything. And I tell myself I must, but after some time, I'm blushing and feel ashamed. And then I'm just quiet. It's the end of conversation. Okay. So we have, these both positive emotional engagement and negative emotional engagement. And this, of course, brings us to the brain again, and to these two ancient kind of like structures in the human brain. So I was talking about the neocortex yesterday, and I said it's the youngest part of the human brain. These two parts that are actually sitting rather deeply in the brain, the nucleus accumbens, which creates positive emotions, and the amygdala. The amygdala is a kind of a warning system, and students who actually get these amygdala responses, those negative feelings, they can't think anymore. And that's the key point. Our emotions are very much entangled with our thinking systems. It's actually kilometers, literally, kilometers of wiring between the different parts of the brain that somehow create these connections. So this is what I showed yesterday. I'm going into this a little bit further now. We said yesterday that, and Gad explained this further. What we have is we have those neuronal networks, and those neuronal networks, they play an extremely important part in remembering information, basically, in remembering language also. And we have these growing networks that, if things work well, are about integrating what we are learning with what we already know and make something new out of that. The question is, what is it that makes these neuronal networks grow? So the point we have is learning is about physical change. Learning is not about storing those word cards in a huge filing system, in a huge static container. Learning is about changing the brain. There is physical change in the brain. So what happens is, what actually, the question for us is, what makes those neuronal networks grow? What are the fertilizers of this neuronal growth? And we're actually talking about the release of certain chemicals in the brain. And this is James Zull, who says the chemicals of emotion. such as adrenaline, serotonin, and dopamine. There are also others, but mainly these three, act by modification of synapses. Synapses are these docking stations, so to speak, that play a major role in the creation of these neuronal networks. And modification of synapses is the very root of learning. So we have arrived at two key points here, and they are basically that learning is a physical process, so the brain changes physically when we are learning something successfully. We are the agents of our students' brain change in some ways, actually. And the second one, and this is a quotation that comes from James Zal, the brain is an organ of emotion. So the answer to you know, this separation of logical, critical thinking and reasoning and emotional engagement is there is no separation. The emotional processes are as important as the cognitive ones because they cannot actually be separated from one another. I'd like to elaborate on a number of principles of emotional engagement because the question for us as teachers has to be, is there anything we can do about it? Is there anything we can do in order to engage our students better emotionally? The answer, of course, is not entertainment. The answer is not having fun all the time. It's not, of course, a teacher who has a great sense of humor will be the teacher students will relate to much better, as we all know. But the answer is not a class where, you know, we have 90% laughter and 10% thinking time. Emotional engagement goes beyond pure entertainment. So what are the principles of this emotional engagement? Well, the first thing is about understanding. Our brain is the ultimate function of our brain is to make sure we survive as individuals, but also as humankind. And James Zal says the brain rewards understanding and not getting the answers right. I can guess answers and I can guess the right answers when I'm lucky. But that doesn't help me to survive. That will not actually contribute to understanding things deeply. If I want to survive, I need to make sure I can understand things better. And this is what the brain is all about. It's important for survival, and for us this means in the classroom we need to challenge our students at the right level. Because if what we do with them is too challenging, what we'll get is frustration, and the amygdala will kick in. If we don't challenge them enough, we'll get boredom, which again is not you know, very good for emotional engagement. So we need the right level of challenge for our students. You may have seen this chart drawn up by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I learned to pronounce the name. He said himself, you know, the only thing you need to remember is Csikszentmihalyi. Okay, Csikszentmihalyi. That's what he said. So what we have here is we have challenges on the vertical axis here and skills on the horizontal one. And what we can see is that what's created when the challenges are too high is anxiety, and we get boredom when students are not challenged enough. So Csikszentmihalyi actually says that people perform best. We get peak performance when people are in this kind of flow channel where there is a good sort of balance between challenge and the skills they are supposed to be activating. So that's the thing here. In ELT, I think we've had a bit of a paradigm shift in the last few years, which I'm very happy about. And that paradigm shift I think, about going beyond language to a certain extent. A lot of colleagues actually talk about the importance of reaching out to students and challenging their thinking, getting them to develop their thinking skills, getting them to develop their critical thinking skills, for example, based on the belief that, as Robert Fisher says, thinking is not a natural function like sleeping, walking, eating, or talking. People do not necessarily become wiser as they become older. They only do if they train their brains, and that's something that I think language learning can be ideally used for, to actually set tasks and challenge the students properly so their thinking skills get activated at the same time as they are learning the language. Again, of course, what we get if this is done properly, we get more neuronal networks, and the language they're learning will actually be remembered better and longer too. So we have critical thinking as one key point here. The second one, and I spoke about that yesterday already, is relevance. I do want to go into this a little bit. Emotional engagement comes from relevance. If what I'm supposed to be reading, listening to, talking about is not regarded as relevant by the brain, then it will not be remembered. I will also not be emotionally engaged. The brain is a very sophisticated information retrieval system. And the brain has this ability, which is actually a security kind of mechanism, to ignore anything and forget anything that is not relevant to us. If you think of the millions and millions and millions of bits of sensory information that we take up basically any time when we are awake, if we could remember all these individual bits of information, we would go crazy pretty soon. So it's a protection mechanism. So memory depends on relevance, and the importance of content is something that is very important here. That drives this process. I don't know, you've probably seen this Gary Larson cartoon. I think it's a wonderful two-part cartoon. Here it is, what we say to dogs, and the dog owner says to his dog, Ginger, he says, "Okay, Ginger, I've had it. You stay out of the garbage, understand, Ginger? Stay out of the garbage or else." That's the first part of the cartoon. And the second part is what they hear. Blah, 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 Ginger, blah, 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 Ginger, blah, 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 Ginger, blah, blah, blah. The insight here is we need to get more ginger into our lessons. We need texts that contain ginger. We need tasks that contain ginger. And the more ginger we can get into the texts and the tasks, the more our students will be emotionally engaged, and language will not go in one ear and out the other, so to speak. The third principle of emotional engagement is about movement. And many of us now might be thinking of doing movements like we did yesterday, you know, a box full of chocolate, etc., etc., etc. Something that happens naturally in a good young learner's classroom. But of course, when we're talking about adults, there are limits to the kind of physical activation we can movement in the teaching and learning processes. So I'm actually not talking about physical movement here. I'm talking about a movement in a metaphorical sense. Movement is inherent in the learning process. When I learn, and I learn something successfully, I'm making progress. This is James Zull. I think I had this yesterday. The key sentence for me, success is progress towards a goal, and nothing succeeds like success. I'm not going to read the rest out. But obviously, when a student is learning successfully, there is a movement element. There is a progress element involved. This is not only about success in learning. This is one of the key elements that makes us avid readers. If you are an avid reader and it's 1 o'clock in the morning and you can't put that book down, then of course you're not moving, you're sitting still, but the story is. The story goes somewhere. And we have this urge, we want to know where the story goes. And we have our anticipation, we somehow anticipate where it'll go. And we hope it'll go in the desired direction. And if it doesn't, we are frustrated, we are disappointed, we are again emotionally engaged. So we have, as James Saul says, we get enjoyment and satisfaction through anticipation of movement and imagined movement. When you're planning a holiday, thinking of going on holiday might give us as much pleasure as the actual holiday. People who love skiing, when they think of the movement of skiing, people who love running, when they think of running, they kind of feel pleasure already when they think about it. In fact, this is probably the most important thing that keeps us reading a good book or watching a movie. We want something to happen or curious about what will happen. Anticipated movement. I would like to do a little activity with you now. I just hope the font up there is big enough. Can you read it back there? Yeah? Okay, thank you. But my task is I'm going to present to you a short piece of text in a rather unusual way. I'm presenting it sentence by sentence. And I will stop for a short while after each sentence. And what I'm asking you to do is I'm asking you to read the sentences. And each time I pause, I want you to observe your own thinking and emotional processes. In other words, what is the kind of anticipated movement that you are engaged in? Where do you expect the story to go? And how do you feel about where the story is going? Okay? Okay, would you just take 2 or 3 minutes, please, and have a chat with the person or the 2 people sitting next to you to talk about your own inner processes, your observations. Happy ending, everybody?
Yeah.
Ah, well, actually, it's a true story. It's a wonderful story. It's the story of Johnny Peacock, who won a gold medal in the 100-meter race in the Paralympics in London in 2012. Okay? So when we do an activity like this one, we can actually notice something that happens all the time when we are reading, but we don't usually think too much about it. We don't become aware of it normally because it happens on a semi-unconscious level, but we constantly think ahead and we constantly have this anticipated movement process going. So anticipated movement is extremely important. And of course, what we need to think about is the quality of text we use in our materials. I think this is a quotation, again, that comes from Henry Widdowson, who says, well, when you look at the history of ELT, we've been through a change from artificial and pragmatically meaningless texts to real English. Sometimes I feel there is a bit too much real English in terms of not enough emotional engagement in materials. And when I'm saying this, I'm thinking of a personal anecdote. I started learning Italian a few years ago. My Italian is still pretty low. maybe A2 or something like that. But like half a year into this learning process, a friend of mine who's Italian gave me one of those simplified readers that publishers publish. And it was probably the trashiest, silliest, schmaltziest kind of like story I had ever read in my life. It was a sort of a romance. I loved it. I devoured every single word in that story. And I thought, isn't that really strange? It's the kind of story I wouldn't even touch in a language I speak and read well. But I was really enjoying the fact that I was able to read this book. It wasn't a book really, it was just 48 pages maybe. But that made me think a lot. You know, when you think of adults who are beginners in a new language, the higher echelons of logical critical thinking that they are able to access in their mother tongue are not always available to them. And that can be a pretty frustrating experience. So I think we need to consider that when we work with adults in the early stages. We actually need texts that are somehow accessible on a lower cognitive level in some ways. This is a model drawn up by educational philosopher Kieran Egan, whose work has influenced me significantly. Kieran Egan talks about different stages in our lives that are actually in many ways parallel to the stages we have gone through in our cultural history. He says when you look at children in early years, in primary school years, they go through a stage that he calls, or a quality of development that he calls mythic understanding. That's the stage when there is no clear borderline between reality and imagination. That's the stage when they actually cannot differentiate between reality and stories, for example. What's typical of this age is story thinking. And what's typical of this age is, of course, also that all kinds of magical things happen when you use a puppet, when you talk to them, and you talk as the puppet or through the puppet. They know the puppet is a puppet is a puppet. And yet, as soon as the puppet starts talking, they almost go into a trance. And for them, the puppet becomes alive. So that's the first stage. Then we have the next quality, which is the teenage years, the adolescent years, romantic understanding, a stage, a quality in their lives when they are so cool on the outside and pretty insecure on the inside, when they actually ask themselves big, existentially threatening questions such as, will I be successful in life? Will I have a good job one day? Will I earn good money? Will I have a family? When will my parents die, and what happens when my parents die? And who will miss me when I die, etc., etc., etc. So that's a stage of a lot of insecurity. And here, the stories they need, so to speak, the narratives they need are often about heroes and heroines that have the qualities that they think, the teenagers think, we need in order to be successful in a rather threatening world, which is, by the way, also the reason why they are so hero and heroine oriented, and this is the reason why Jay-Z and Justin Bieber and who have you, you know, why all these people who come from the glitz and glamour of the rock or the rap or the film world are so important for those teenagers, because they use them as projection shields, screens. They project onto them the qualities. Because they are successful, they project onto them the big qualities that they think we need in order to be successful. And then, you know, that's interesting when authors of teenage materials ask teenagers, what would you like to have in your text? And they say Justin Bieber. And then they write a text about Justin Bieber, which gets published 3 years later. And the text smells so dated it is when students read it the first time. And then they're totally frustrated because students actually don't like those texts. Surprise, surprise. So my suggestion there would actually be to go for emotional engagement and have texts about real life heroes and heroines. So the next point, that's us, the mature adult thinker, philosophic, no, sorry, we've gone beyond that stage already. The philosophic understanding quality, that's the student in early university years, when metacognition becomes important, when story, but also talking about story and analyzing story becomes essential. And then last but not least, that's us, ironic understanding, the intellectually fully developed adult mind. The interesting thing about this is not only a sophisticated state of mind and thinking, it's also a state of mind where we can freely enjoy the qualities of all the other states. When we are reading a children's story to our children or grandchildren, it's far below our intellectual level, but we are enjoying it nevertheless. So my theory there is that if we can't access, because we don't have the language, the higher echelons of ironic understanding, then why not use texts which are actually somehow in line and contain elements from the other lower, so to speak, qualities. So, you know, in order to get this flow going, I have a little anecdote here for you. This is a photo I took in a bookshop on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro. I gave a talk there, okay? The Libreria La Travessa, a fantastic bookshop. I don't know about you. I read from, you know, I use a Kindle and I read from screens, but I still love the real thing. The smell of books, especially the ones that have my name on the cover. Anyway, so I gave a talk there, and this photo I took almost, you know, before 5 minutes before closing hours. But I took another photo, and that was a photo of a little girl, and she was tucked away in a corner, and she was actually reading a book. And I am not a bad photographer. I blurred this on purpose because there were so many people in the bookshop. It was chock-a-block with people. I could not see who her parents were, so I couldn't ask whether I was going to be allowed to use this photograph. So I photoshopped it to make it blurred. What we have here is, I think, an image that captures perfectly what Joy Egbert in her study on flow theory in the foreign language classroom calls focused attention. That's what we need from our students. That's what our students need in order to do as much as possible of this minds-on learning, as I called it in the session yesterday. If we want them to create those neuronal networks, if we want them to integrate new knowledge and skills with their prior knowledge, then we need focused attention. This is from a study carried out by McQuillan and Cond a couple of years ago, and they actually looked into the kind of texts that that support this flow state best. And they were talking about students, adult students or young adult students, again, whose language level was not C1, you know, who were still in a pretty low early stage of their learning. They say most of the texts that supported flow were those that participants had read for their own enjoyment, one in which they had interest, and those in narrative form, partly because it was easier to focus on these texts. So that's my argument when it comes to students in their early stages of learning, we need to make sure we get enough of those content elements such as humor and strong emotional contrast, stories about heroes and heroines, about the extreme, the absurd and the weird and wonderful in. Of course, when they are, as I said a minute ago, on C1 level, things are very, very different. But then more intellectually challenging content is actually available to them because they have the language for that. And there is another point here, and this is about text relevance. This comes from a book which I can highly recommend, published in 2013 by Lisa Cron. The book is titled Wired for Story. So our brain is wired for story. There is something about stories that makes us listen when we hear one, that makes us want to understand when we read one. And she says, you know, it's more than language. The reason our already overloaded brain devotes so much precious time and space to allowing us to get lost in a story is that without stories, we'd be toast. Stories allow us to stimulate intense experiences without actually having to live through them. This was a matter of life and death back in the Stone Age, when if you waited for experience to teach you that the rustling in the bushes was actually a lion looking for lunch, you'd end up the main course. And here is the lion. It is a lioness. I took the photo myself. I asked her if she was a lion. Yes. So she says, she carries on to say, when a story meets our brain's criteria, we relax and slip into the protagonist's skin, eager to experience what his or her struggle feels like without having to leave the comfort of home. Story is more than language. Story is relevant if it contains something that engages us emotionally because it's important for our lives. So somebody said yesterday, images are important when it comes to making language memorable, and I couldn't agree more. When we look at images in language learning materials these days, language teaching materials, they are often so beautiful. Glossy pictures. A bit bland sometimes, maybe. And when you compare them across different kind of like materials, you will often find very, very similar images and sometimes even the same because they come from the same agency. So there's two images I'm going to present to you. Let's call the first one A. You can see it up there, A. And the second one we're going to call B. And my question is, which of the two images, if you think of anticipated movement, which of the two images is more likely to go somewhere? Which is more likely to trigger off associations in the students' minds? Which is more likely to get students to want to say something because they are more emotionally engaged? A or B? Yeah, I think that was already the vote, wasn't it? A or B? A is beautiful, isn't it? Could be on any billboard for any kind of like promoting any kind of product. And in fact, I gave a very similar session in northern Cyprus the other day, and the colleague from CUP was driving me to the airport. And we were in the streets of that city. I can't remember where it was. And suddenly he said, "That's it." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Look at that billboard over there and watch it. Here they're drinking what? Water probably. And here is the billboard. Same photo. What are they drinking? A soft drink." So it's the kind of image that looks good, that is bland, but it actually it's not going anywhere, really. So I think we need to consider that images are actually extremely important also. We want images that go somewhere. The fourth point, I'm going to rush this a little bit. I'm coming to the end here. The fourth point is about ownership. And you may think of ownership being a question of owning material things. I mean, I own a laptop and a house and a car and a cell phone, what have you. But ownership and language, well, we own language that we create. If you think of writing poetry, for example, if you've written a poem, if you've written a story, it's your story, isn't it? When you talk to a colleague about a problem that needs a solution at your school, your institution, and then suddenly you come up with a great idea and your colleague says, hey, this is fantastic, I think that's the solution. And during the next coffee break, you suddenly notice that the same colleague is sharing your idea with others, but not mentioning that it was your idea, actually pretending it was his. How will you feel? Disappointed? Somebody has stolen something from you? What have they stolen? Your idea and the language you used in order to express your idea. Copyright is, by the way, an example of that. So it's got to do, of course, with experimental learning processes. We need experimental learning processes. I'm going to skip Scott's quotation here, which is about an error-welcoming engagement of the student and not a fallacy of error-free learning. We need hands-on, minds-on experimentation with language and not instruction, 100% of instruction-led pedagogy. So I'm not talking about LOA, but I think LOA is a very, very important element of emotional engagement, and we heard all about it and discussed it yesterday. And last but not least, personalization. And this is where I'm coming to the end, because I don't need to talk about personalization. You know what it's all about. And I hope we agree that it's an extremely important factor when it comes to emotional engagement. I'd like to finish off with a quotation again that comes from that language maverick, that young person who successfully learned 6 languages. I said, do you have any advice for teachers when it comes to emotional engagement? And he said, I think teachers should be encouraged to forget the idea I have to teach the language in exchange for, I want my students to learn the language by showing them what the attraction of language is. A teacher has to make the language interesting. Language is about culture. It's about music, it's about film, it's about literature, it's about people. It's about you and me. Thank you very much.